Hey everybody, it's Patrick Lovell, Truth Bomb riffing on, let's see, it's Wednesday, October 11th, 2023 at approximately 2 p.m. my time. And God, there's so much coming at us fast and furious, and it's like, wow, right? But yet, I'm here in this situation where, on a personal level, our growth on our YouTube channel is, moving in the right direction. Although, unfortunately, it's not moving in the right direction to the quantity that we needed to as fast as we needed to, considering everything that's going on and the information that I have. And however this turns out, I'm going to try to connect with you to the best of my ability to hopefully domino something that I swear to God, I don't know if I'm capable of. Look, there's so much going on, it's overwhelming. I don't know where I want to begin, but I do know that I'm coming at you, a guy that many of you might not know. In fact, most of you don't know, and this is this weird Groundhog Day where I have to reintroduce who I am every time. I'm Patrick Lovell. I'm a producer. I'm an investigative journalist. I'm a muckraking journalist. I produced, quite frankly, the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy Grail, all wrapped into one, because it's the blueprint of how this world works that nobody understands. And it's called The Con, and it's free. And you can find it at www.thecon.tv. And unfortunately, The Con isn't all you need to know, but it's definitely something you need to wrap your mind around to be able to understand what we're dealing with. Because it's like, I'd like to say this, to people I'm talking to for the first time where I'm introducing this sort of thing. And you've got to think of me like this, right? Imagine your spouse is involved with an affair and you don't know it. And I've got the information, and I'm giving you the information so that you can make the appropriate decision of what you want to do that's appropriate for, your life and what you've invested in and so on and so forth. But you can't make a decision without having the information. And that's ultimately what the con does, but at an astronomical level, way beyond the metaphor or the analogy that I just made. But, further to that, what I need to kind of make you aware of is that, like many of you, I'm just a regular person. I'm a person who cares about his family. I care about things that are good and reasonable, and the type of things that most of us, find to be, I don't know, what we kind of expect in society, at least American society. I mean, like, for example, I love animals. I love dogs. I love dog people, right? I love to have a good time. I prefer to go to concerts and have great rollicking good times watching football games and whatever else, and kind of transmitting everything that's happening in our lives with good people and, enjoying ourselves. And, like the perfect day for me would be to go longboarding and then finish it up with cervezas and Baja tacos, and that's kind of who I am. And I'm 54 years old, about to be 55, and I hate to admit it, but, it's freaking insane based on what it is that I've got to reveal to you. And primarily, this reality that I'm dealing with, which juxtaposes how my whole journey started, which was a journey that began right before about this time 15 years ago in front of my 40th birthday. And like most people in our society who got a college education and went to work and had a family, by the time you get to 40, you're really supposed to be pretty together, and you're on your way to building that kind of nest egg and that life and that stability and all of those things that we all aspire to, especially if we get into a situation where we have families, to be those, guiding instructors and improve upon our life and help the next generation foster, their entry into the world in a way that will hopefully make their lives better than our generation, just like we did with our parents and that sort of thing. And when I was about to turn 40 years old, man, I got to tell you, I was in a tumultuous time that felt like the world was going to end, not too unlike the situation we're in now, because prior to the 2008 great financial crisis and me about to turn 40, I was with my beautiful wife and my beautiful son, and I felt like it was in this time period, because of what took place that was shaping up to get to the 2008 great financial crisis. I felt like, that David Byrne epiphany where it's like, and you may ask yourself, how did you get here, right? And you may ask yourself, my God, what have I done? And that was my life. And ultimately what happened with me was I was a producer. I was making six figures. I was a senior producer. I'd already been in the business and I was aspiring to become what my career path had led me to. And I was actually living the American Dream 101. I was in my first house, had a cat, two cats, and a dog, and everything was beautiful, man. It was just one of those things. It was like this, Norman Rockwell portrait that I was laying down on, quite frankly, at the time, Facebook, which was new to the game at that time, right? And I remember, like it was yesterday, putting together my 40th birthday that my wife and I were going to do with a bunch of cool, beautiful friends that I had the good fortune of having at that time period. Down in South Beach in Miami. We're all going to go to a cool boutique hotel, and they had this great rooftop pool and bar that, the idea was we're going to hang out every day and do all those kinds of fun things that cool, beautiful couples do that have their lives together to celebrate, right? And to look back on your monumental journey to get to that moment. And I can't believe looking back that I thought that was like the end, but it was, as it turns out, the beginning of the end, and however you want to interpret that. But what happened was I go from the six-figure job in my first house and living the American Dream 101 to being caught up in this unbelievable, the world-ending apocalypse where the economy was dying, and me as a producer who has to depend on capital to produce new projects was going down the tubes fast. And I had, at that time, a relationship with a guy that was a big-time developer, had a lot of money. He was a good guy. Super cool dude who came from that era. Used to go to like all the widespread panic shows, and we'd go to all sorts of cool shows and ski and snowboard and surf and all that kind of cool stuff together. And he was a wealthy dude, and he was going to invest in my company, and we were going to go to the next level. And lo and behold, the 2008 great financial hit. And because he was a developer, he was losing millions, which meant that I lost everything. And I was in this situation where suddenly my life went to a place that I'd never believed possible. And I felt like I was, thrown out in the desert naked, trying to find a way to get back to society with my family on my back and nothing. And ultimately that was kind of what led to this righteous grind that took place over the last really 13 years, because that's when my journey started. When I was able to find kind of a replacement to the guy who had to give up on our endeavors. And I found one several years later after great heartache and failure and suicidal tendencies and all sorts of horrific revelations that forced me to kind of reconfigure my understanding of the world. And one thing led to another, and I was able to successfully put together, because I'm an entrepreneur. And I'll say this up front. As a producer, I'm a capitalist. You have to be. I'm not a capitalist in the way that a robber baron or a Confederate would exploit slave labor and destroy everybody through monopolies to extract through slave wages, something that makes me insanely rich. No, capital was an investment to people willing to take the risk in projects that they believed in, that gave me the opportunity to do what I do, which is being a producer and a muckraking journalist, and quite frankly, somebody obsessed with the truth. Not liking the truth that Elon Musk just laid out on X, which is ridiculous, but the truth. And that's what these last, 15 years, but really call it 13 years in terms of me actually being able to go on this journey as an investigative journalist and a producer, to put everything that I put together in this incredible blueprint for how the world works called The Con, that's now available to you for free at www.thecon.tv. So what am I doing on the eve of my 55th birthday besides wanting to completely give up at a time where the world is once again falling apart? Well, I want to win. And I want to win in an extraordinarily glorious way, because that's who I am and that's who I've always been. But I've got the sort of pathway, the pathology, the paradigm, the ebbs and flows of how this thing has got to work to be able to create what I call a tidal wave populist crusade to purge corruption. And the way that's going to work is that you have to understand, know the lay of the land. And I don't know who you are and where you are in your journey and what's important to you and everything else. But for me, what's important above all else is liberty and justice for all. And the only way you have liberty and justice for all is when you have the integrity of law. And what I have learned is that we do not have the integrity of law. We're not a country of, by, and for the people. We're a country of, by, and for the corruption. And I have the only answers, literally, and I know that sounds ridiculous because it is ridiculous, But I have the answers in the entire world that can take the whole fucking system down. And we've got to do it. And it's just like, it's just like any number of movies or television series or books or, biblical stories that we're in the midst of. And it's just really crazy and wild and unique to be able to put this all together for you. But before I launch into the whole campaign, I mean, my friends, if you believe in liberty and justice for all, if you, me, and everyone you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in decency and dignity and decency and integrity and sustainability and beauty, if we unite, we will defeat the misery of tyranny. And that is our destiny. And that's what I call the clean new deal. And the only way to do that is really, there's two pathways to do that. One is a fucking insanely bloody revolution against the most powerful military and police state in the history of the world that none of us could ever have a chance to defeat unless we understood A, the facts of how everything works, or B, that, God came down and somehow smited the enemies of righteousness, which I doubt is going to happen. But maybe in a material, metaphorical, analogy, it is all happening. But I guess I got to make the case for that, and it really is up to me to do this, and it's ridiculous that it is, all things considered. But the nature of the moment, the nature of what I'm telling you, the nature of what we're in the midst of is that my shortcut is corruption, burdens, fuels fascism. And that we are not a democracy. And so if you believe in democracy, if you believe in the integrity of law, if you believe in the purpose of America, the way it was designed, then you believe in patriotism, and you have to rise to become a patriot. Now, like I said, there's two pathways to the revolution that has to happen. It's either a bloody, violent revolution that I don't think anybody can win, or it's a monumental civil rights-like movement equipped with the truth that galvanizes everyone, particularly the good people in our armed services, in our police and government and everything else that are like what I'm expressing, which I know there's more of us than them, but it gets really complicated when people's paychecks depend on them not knowing what it is they get paid by. And that's part and parcel to what it is that I've got to reveal to you. And so I'm telling you right now, look, I'm requesting your investment in the clean new deal. What I'm asking for is $13, one-time fee of $13. If you happen to do something that we're incentivizing, which is if you bring 13 people and you raise $169, we'll also give you a t-shirt with one of our incredible hashtags that summarize this whole thing. But we've got to build a movement. And the way it works, I don't know how many of you understand the nature of politics post-2012 Citizens United, but money is speech. And there's no way that we can elevate what it is that we're trying to say unless we're all invested. That's just what they've done. In fact, the Supreme Court, through the decision of Citizens United, practically and did, for all intents and purposes, made corruption legal. If you understand how the system works, which ironically and mind-numbingly, befuddlingly funny in an almost Monty Python way, is Donald Trump has no fucking inclination of, otherwise he would have paid hush money payments to Stormy Daniels to cover up lies to a porn star during, basically what happened in the 2016 election, given the rules of Citizens United. All he had to do was manifest this behind a 501c4 and have charitable contributions into different pockets that could be hidden in LLCs and that sort of thing, that ultimately could achieve the same thing, if not much more efficiently than just straight up corruption, and achieve the same purpose, if not more so, which is part and parcel to these underhanded dynamics of legalizing corruption in one way, but pretending that we're not legalizing it in another way, which is this whole cacophony of this stupid mental gymnastics circus that we're all in the midst of, that I'm trying to provide you clarity, which I have in our work, again, www.thecon.tv, which interestingly enough cost me total over the course of, let's call it about 9 years in the process, $4.5 million, which puts literally, if you guys, which we're now offering for free, a 5-part series that reveals the $29 trillion truth, as if you're moved after fully understanding that and you came on board and you invested $13, we'd have to, realize that from 357,000 contributors. to be able to match what we've already done. That doesn't include the incredible sacrifice that I've had to go through this whole time with tens of thousands of hours and everything that I've learned that have both nearly destroyed me and redeemed me at the same time, but I'll save that story for another day. But the idea is that we've got to create this populist crusade to purge corruption, and we're going to do it twofold. The first is I've got to be able to manifest what I continue to do, and many of you have already seen this. I think we've reached probably tens of thousands and millions in some social media scenarios like TikTok, which is ridiculous, and then still working on it. And I really appreciate all of you who have discovered me on YouTube, but please like and subscribe and share, and maybe watch this over and over, but please watch all of our work. Again, I've already said the con at www.thecon.tv, but I also did a podcast called The New Untouchables, and you can find that at The Real Progressives if you do a Google search for either one of those two names, and you'll see the whole cacophony of this whole thing. Now, to invest your time to be able to understand so much of what I've put forward, and I've got so much else, to be honest with you, it's about a 20-hour investment of your time. Or you can study, the 414 or so truth bombs I've done on Patrick Level Truth Bombs, The Con, which are all over YouTube and also on TikTok and also on Twitter, different variations of them. But you can get all of it from there. But hopefully this is your sort of journey there. If example for all of you that have been joining recently and joined us, I'm going to take it a step further and I'm going to try to bring this full circle, because the most important piece of this whole thing is, one, your enlightenment. Two, your buy-in. You do that with a $13 investment, but if you can't afford it, we would love to have your involvement in to spread the message, to learn everything that we have, and to get on board and to become a vector for truth, because the truth has to elevate over this madness, this darkness, this diabolical grift of, I'm going to say, Satan himself, metaphorically, because the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist, and we're living in the dark ages. I shit you not. And we all know it, but now it's about to explode in the next incarnation of what we're in the midst of. And if you know anything about the history of the world, considering particularly World War I, we're a hair trigger away from a potentially catastrophe. And to put it into perspective, World War II, for example, had 75 million dead approximately, right? With a global population of 2.3 billion. The equivalency of that with a global population of about 8 billion, we'd have to lose about 300 million people. And I think that could happen a lot quicker in a nuclear Armageddon, which is literally realistic considering what's going on. And yet it's all so fucking absurd. But I'm going to try to tie together what we're doing in this populist crusade of truth and justice and liberty and justice for all, which I hope will be global, quite frankly, in a Star Trek kind of way, if we can win. That's going to tie to everything that's happening in the Middle East, if I can have your attention. And hopefully I'm in competition with a lot better looking people and who do crazy, stupid, fucking insanely brilliant and monumentally dumbass shit every fucking moment of every day, a million times a day, that has all of our attention, which makes it very difficult to provide you the truth that can save the world, which is the $29 trillion truth. And I'm the only guy that can get you there because of the work that we've done that exposes the largest criminal conspiracy and cover-up in history that never ended, but that ultimately led to, and this is the only thing that nobody will reveal to you that I can't, and it's the bottom line. What happened after the 2008 Great Financial Crisis, after the calamity that wiped out 100 million plus people, both in the United States and around the world, based on a massive global racketeering enterprise, was that the Federal Reserve circled the wagons, and behind the corridors of power in the shadows that nobody saw because media was in on it, they put into position the lender of last resort capacity called Federal Reserve Act 13.3. It's important to remember that number, Federal Reserve Act 13.3, that provides the ability for the Federal Reserve to provide emergency liquidity in times of all sorts of crises, right? But not for criminal activity, particularly as it relates to the most basic of concepts as it relates to finance. You don't finance to a collateral that's worth zero without the proper underwriting and everything else, but especially that collateral that was worth zero based on massive racketeering and fraud. Nowhere in the world does it say that in the statutes, and nowhere in the world would that fly unless this happened secretly. And it did. But right in front of our face, but with duplicity and this Orwellian language and a bunch of, duck dives and don't want to relate it to surfers. Sorry, I'll just say smoke and mirrors. Because most of America doesn't understand our system and what's supposed to happen, let alone the basics. But that enabled the power of this griftopia, this monstrous corruption, to basically backdoor tens of trillions of dollars of liquidity to those that blew up the world. I.e., the greatest trick the devil ever played was to convince the world he didn't exist. And they must have thought we were all some kind of new fool because they kept pissing on our head telling us it's rain, but they didn't see Patrick Lovell coming. And yes, I am the deliverer. Am I Moses? Am I Jesus? I'm the producer. And that'll make a little bit more sense with the kind of the silly, I'll call it, Monty Python-esque, or Mel Brooks kind of analogy. But, look, man, people, I'm trying to create deliverance, i.e., exodus from corruption, to create, which is completely possible, the resurrection of the American dream, if only you understand the ebbs and flows and the nuts and bolts of what the fuck happened to butt fuck all of you while you're now got your heads buried in the sand and everybody pretending like, well, where's the savior? Nobody's going to come save us. This thing's too overwhelming. Nobody has the answers. What are we going to do? I'll let the bad guys get away with it. Fuck that. Corruption births and fuels fascism. Fuck corruption. Fuck fascism. Join me. Again, if you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi, who believes in integrity, dignity, and sustainability and liberty, and we, and beauty, and we come together in unity, we will defeat the misery of tyranny to usher in the Clean New Deal. And you do that peacefully through a civil rights revolution, quite frankly, let's call it that, unlike the Bernie Sanders make-believe revolution, to basically carry the Ark of the Covenant and the last grail of the truth to overwhelm the evil of deception and diabolical misery of betrayal. That's what we're all in the midst of, and we have been for a very long time. So, just to kind of check off the boxes, and again, just to kind of go to the numbers real quick, let's just say the ultimate goal is to get 13 million people to donate $13, invest $13, contribute, whatever the case may be, to give voice to those who don't have a voice based on this incredible information that I've already spent $4.5 million to get. If 357,000 of you join this odyssey, this crusade, then you'll match what we've already done. So think of it as we're marching in unison, because you plus me equals we the people. And we are not a government of, for, and by the people. And I'm trying to create and get us back to a government of, for, and by the people, because we're of, for, and by the corruption. So where do you begin in this big labyrinth of this big mess of everything that's going on, given what I just piecemealed together? Well, first of all, I'm requesting your investment on one-time fee, $13, because of what the number symbolizes and what it means on my journey, first and foremost. So again, I'm smack dab in the middle of my 13th year of this freaking odyssey, first and foremost. But it was all predicated, and I learned this long ago, in honor of really the original 13 colonies that came together to defeat the misery of tyranny, which was King George III and the East India Trading Company in that era against, the most powerful army in the world, where they spilt their own blood and sacrificed, even though they were flawed. And I can make that argument in a moment, and I will actually, because a lot of people get hung up on the founders and whether or not they're worthy of our praise and belief mechanisms and all that systems, but they are, because they sacrificed their lives to usher in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and separation of powers, which was the only answer to tyranny that had ever existed in the world. And yeah, those of you who understand your history could argue that the oligarchs from the Magna Carta were really what it was about in landowners, and that goes all the way back to the democracy of Greece and that sort of thing, which, of course, the landowners of America, and that's all they knew at that time, to get to what Jefferson said is a great system if you can keep it. But he also said that the tree of liberty has to be quenched with the blood of tyrants and patriots from time to time. And he's absolutely right? So the original 13 colonies came together and they sacrificed everything to give us this opportunity. And it's been a slug, a ground slug every which way to Sunday from the very beginning. And by the way, from the very beginning, we had abolitionists, and they didn't want slavery. And yet they compromised the 3/5 statutes and everything else to be able to defeat the English, which was an impossibility at the time, to be able to become independent. And then ultimately, yeah, we went in a specific way to landowners and slavery and all that stuff until what? Until the better angels of our nature came together, again, at great sacrifice and blood expense that ultimately gave us Abraham Lincoln and the American Civil War and the 13th Amendment. There's again 13, to break the bonds of slavery and everything that came with it, and the millions of people that died from it and sacrificed themselves so that we could move in order to form a more perfect union for the better angels of our nature. Where of course during the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln said, "A nation of by and for the people shall not perish from this earth," which is again the side that I'm on, the side of liberty and justice for all, which has really been the battle from the very beginning of time. But moving forward, without those sorts of revolutions, of those wars, of those things that took place, it wouldn't have given us the opportunity to get the progressive movement of Teddy Roosevelt and everything that led to becoming the Teddy Roosevelt movement I know it's on the tip of your tongue because it's on the tip of my tongue, trust busting, but that was a result of all of the things that took place with what? Labor rights movement, the farmers that were rebelling against Wall Street monopolies, and then ultimately, women's suffrage, and then the civil rights era and everything that gave rise to everything that we became in order to form a more perfect union, as well as the environmental rights movement. That all happened, people, post-Civil War until Teddy Roosevelt in the early 1900s, and then, of course, which then led further after the Great Depression, which is another big part of this, which is a huge part of this, which of course led to FDR calling out the ancient enemies of freedom and justice when he said, "I welcome their hate," to create and manifest the New Deal. And so I'm doing a very similar, at least in the tradition of patriotism through the progressive movement, in order to form a perfect union that then, after World War II and the defeat of fascism, made us the most powerful nation on earth, alongside our fight with communists and communist Russia and everything that manifested in the Cold War. But ultimately, we had the civil rights movement, again, in order to form a more perfect union. Every generation has to fight, in the metaphor, the blood of both tyrants and patriots to quench the tree of liberty. And here we are again. And 13 is a huge piece of the puzzle, and I hope to convey to you, although I would love to have her on board, Taylor Swift and the Swifties are all big fans of 13, and I don't know all the reason and details behind that, but it would really be great to have Taylor Swift on board, because if she understood everything that I'm talking about, I got a feeling she'd be on our side, because she is certainly somebody who champions liberty and dignity and decency and unity and beauty and that sort of thing. And good on you, Taylor, and the Swifties for that. But continuing forward with the metamorphosis of this journey and what it all means and how it all connects to the number and what we're in the midst of and everything else, it's really biblical. And it's a trip, because I'm not a religious guy, okay? But I'm going to borrow from biblical teachings and other things that people can relate to. And I'll start with what is really the most obvious, okay? Right now in the Middle East, in Israel, what many people refer to as the Holy Land, which could potentially domino, which is a continuation of this saga and this horrific aspect of the devils of our nature, that is creating a situation that we've seen over the course of the last several days. Things like children and Hamas that they've already murdered and butchered, and grandmothers that they're using their cell phones to cut their heads off to make the point that, they want massive war, end time war, right? And that's happening right in front of our face. Regardless of where you come down on the equation of the formula and the calculus of everything that's involved with the so-called Holy Land, and trust me, I know all of the intricacies of what's taken place since Israel shaped up, as well as the 1,000 years before that created that situation. And if we, have this conversation without talking about the Holocaust, you're not having an honest conversation, because it was the Holocaust that led to the creation of Israel. And by the way, the Palestinians were on the side of the Nazis at that time, and the powers that be, the English and the Germans, had huge influences, and then ultimately the Balfour Declaration and blah, blah, blah. Okay, so I'll circle back to that, but just in terms of I'm just going to make the biblical reference to Armageddon. So over the course of the last 20, 30 years, we've seen this move of evangelicals in the United States that have been all in on Israel. So why are they all in on Israel? Well, because they want to usher in the second coming. How do you get the second coming? Well, because of the rapture of Armageddon in the Middle East. That's what the Bible says, and that's what they believe, and that's what they've all been on. And so, yeah, millions upon millions upon millions of people actually believe that and are probably gearing up for massive war, and they're on the side, in this case, of the Israelis, the Jews, because that's what the Bible says. Now, is that because that they support Israel and the democratic state of Israel? No, it's because they believe in the rapture. And quite frankly, Jesus ushering in, I guess, the destruction of all the non-believers, and everybody goes to heaven and, recapitulates, the dead, blah, 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 whatever. The long and the short of it is, though, it's really kind of intriguing from this perspective, right? So the story of where we are with Gaza and Hamas and the Palestinians and Hezbollah and Iran and everything that's taken up, let's call it the last 20 years. I want to kind of focus on the last 20 years because that gets us to understand really kind of what's going on. And I got to make kind of a pop culture reference in the context of what I see manifesting. And the easiest one for me to think of is Game of Thrones. So do you remember a few years back when we were getting to the final episodes of the final season of Game of Thrones, and the good guys had fought the existential threat, the army of the dead, and Daenerys Targaryen, who had proclaimed the entire sort of arc of that story that she was going to break the wheel, and the armies of the good guys, the Unsullied and oh God, what are they? It'll come to me in a minute, but after they defeated the army of the dead, behind Jon Snow and everything else, they wind up, going to King's Landing because that's the end-all be-all, the Iron Throne, which incidentally takes you to the Iron Bank, right? Which in the real world is the Federal Reserve and the White House and Congress. But going back to the analogy. So as the armies of the good guys, the Starks and Targaryen or Daenerys and, the Unsullied and the Dothraki is who I was trying to think of, they were all congregating, to basically go after King's Landing. But then, Daenerys decided she's going to take her 3 dragons and join Jon Snow, who, made the argument that, look, without defeating the existential crisis, we're all dead. And so she believed in him and she dove in it. That's what they did. But prior to that, if you remember the scene, there was this really monumental moment for those of you who are Game of Thrones fans, where there was this meeting. I think it was the Lion and the Wolf, right? I think that was the episode, probably end of season 7, where everybody came together, all of our favorite characters, and they had to demonstrate that they had this zombie creature that was part of the, the army of the dead that they had to show to Cersei to kind of get her attention and everything that translated at that time. And it did, and they were successful. But the other part of that story was that Jon Snow was supposed to, I guess they inferred it, that he was supposed to not say that he had bent the knee to, Daenerys, right? Because that was the subplot of the whole thing. And Jon Snow says this great line, which is probably one of the greatest lines that I was living vicariously through, considering everything that I've been through this whole time period, where he said, when there are only lies, you only get better and better lies, and the truth means nothing, and I can't bend the knee to that. And that's who I am in this whole situation. So again, I've kind of made some corollaries to Moses and Jesus and now Jon Snow, and I don't pretend to be those guys in a real way. I'm just saying the lessons and the metaphors of the story that they, all in their own ways, basically impart is what we're all in the midst of. And so what happened in the lessons for that, ultimately what I'm getting at, what we're all in the midst of in terms of watching Gaza unfold, considering all the horrific inhumanity that Hamas displayed in this attack off the heels of what a lot of people will talk about, the open-air prison and everything that's happened over the last 20 years with Israel skewing and becoming, and I hate to admit it, as a Jewish person who's a Reformed Jew, who's not an Orthodox, and who believes in Israel, but at the same time has been very, very ashamed of so much that's happened over the course of the last 20 years, is the acknowledgement that, yeah, the Israelis have become in many ways, an apartheid state that are using a police state with an open-air prison in Gaza, in West Bank, for better or for worse, in a lot of these horrific, you can't win ways because of the nature of the battle and everything else. Because you know, they're not a democracy. Israel's not a democracy. They're not. The whole idea is that Israel was supposed to be a democracy and is in its heart, in its biblical context, a democracy, but it hasn't been for the past 20 years. And that's part and parcel to the story that I'm revealing to you. So, for example, Sheldon Adelson and these billionaires and these maneuvers of the West Bank settlers and everything else, you know, in addition to the reacting of a superior military to whatever the terroristic forces of Hamas and Hezbollah have been over the years, you know, we're able to force, you know, those two Palestinian segments into, you know, these two what became open-air prisons in the West Bank and in Gaza. And, oh yeah, by the way, that happened because there were homicide bombers on buses with shrapnel trying to murder as many innocent people as they did in an intifada that lasted a very long time, to where Israel was like, nah, no more. And then they created the wall and the police state and everything else that we're talking about, which ironically, and which is heartbreaking and unbelievably sickening for people like myself, particularly who understand the history of Judaism, but particularly as it resulted in, or the Jewish plight, as it related to what happened in Nazi Germany, in the ghettos, in the Warsaw Ghetto, and all of these other things, which became the final solution. Yeah, trust me, the irony isn't lost on me that the problems are so remarkably horrific and parallel and everything else. But I will say this, and I want to say this to the likes of anybody who's listening, from people that I respect and I love, like Roger Waters, who I know is an anti-fascist, but he's also anti-Israeli fascist. And if he and others would have said from the very beginning an acknowledgement and their understanding that it was the Holocaust that led to the creation of the Jewish state, and there was no other choice, because there were 6 million Jews that were murdered through horrific ways that none of you can imagine. And how many people, and this is what the Jewish people have had to deal with forever, how many of you, because Jews are successful in many ways, and you know, and a lot of people that are poor and everybody else, they want to blame the Jews for a lot of things that a lot of Jews in those positions of power are actually guilty of. I will say that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But in this particular case, it's like the Holocaust created Israel, which led to this nonstop carnage, which led to survival of those who were going to go the distance. And so now we're in this parallel, right? And so going back to the pop culture, you know, analogy with Daenerys Targaryen, when after the good guys defeated the army of the dead and they go down to King's Landing and they ultimately offer and proffer, because of all of the influence of Tyrion Lannister, was, look, he didn't want to see all of the misery of the innocents being slaughtered in King's Landing, right? You remember that? And what he was saying to Daenerys, you can't do it, because then you have no credibility. But Daenerys was saying, I'm going to break the wheel. And ultimately she gave Cersei Lannister the option, put down your arms, walk away, give me the power, and we'll let the citizens of King's Landing live. But what was Cersei's response? She cut the head off of Melisandre, yeah, right? And after all of the sacrifice that the character Daenerys Stormborn did, it was kind of like, okay, the shit's on. And what ultimately happened? Well, it's pretty much similar to what we saw in the real world after or during World War II, when the Allies and the Russians, quite frankly, but the Allies, in this analogy, firebombed Dresden and Berlin and all of the German cities, because you weren't going to defeat the Nazis without absolute victory. And by the way, the Russians, for all of you who are anti-communist supposedly, and even though many of you are Trump supporters, you're okay with Putin and all of that really strange mishigas and how all that works, and I'll have to address that as well. But, you know, the Russians lost 25 million people in the war against the Germans. So you think that they were going to slow down in their approach to Berlin when they were driving to defeat the enemy that had caused them so much insane misery and bloodlust that you can't even fathom? America that has to watch TikTok and chicks dancing and lip syncing and all the stuff that we watch that I watch too. I'm not putting it down. I'm just saying it captures our attention, and we don't think about these things until there's a massive war on our hands, and then we're looking right down the barrel of what could lead to literally Armageddon, either biblically or in reality, right? Because it's a hair trigger away. Why? Because quite frankly, the centerpiece of all of it, which comes back to my whole process of the Clean New Deal, which is oil. Oil, quite frankly, is what fuels most of these conflicts in a way that works towards the autocrats. Now, Israel, I have fancied over the course of the last 20 years, through their monopoly and their incredible innovation as far as technology, and they're incredibly brilliant when it comes to intelligence, which is ridiculous. What happened in Gaza was supposedly, several thousand rockets that I think maybe the Gazans put together like piece by piece, which I think is what they did. And I'm not exactly sure, but we'll get more information about the intelligence failures of the Israelis. But ultimately, Israel's playing ball with Saudi Arabia. What is Saudi Arabia? It's a religious theocracy. Israel is looking at the neighborhood and they're like, democracy doesn't really work. Democracy is not going to work because we don't have a partner in peace. We don't have a partner in peace because, as we all know, nobody's talking about the Holocaust. Nobody's talking about our right to exist. So we're going to fucking kill them all, which is ironically what? The final solution, which is ridiculous. But at the same time, when you think about, for example, the fiction of the storyline given Daenerys Targaryen in Game of Thrones, she said all along she's going to break the will, and she gave Cersei an option, and basically at the end, after she had it thrown in her face and she went as far as she did at the sacrifice she did, she's like, no, I'm bringing it. And then she ultimately did what in the real world, like I said, we firebombed Dresden, the Russians came in, they pulverized the Nazis to no end, and the Nazis were gone for good until they came back and all the shit that's been going on for the last, they never really left, but they certainly got some leverage now, don't they? And the irony of this whole thing and this whole shtick is that, you've got these autocrats. So Israel, let me go back to Israel real quick in terms of the most important aspect of Armageddon and Rapture in biblical times and all of these types of things that are very peculiar, especially as it relates to the number 13, okay? So as quickly as I can, Moses leads Exodus from the bondage of Pharaoh, right? In that you get the 10 Commandments, you get the Red Sea, you get the 10 plagues, you get all of that great story, which is the reason I'm Jewish, to be honest with you, above all else. I believe in Exodus. I believe in liberty. I believe in anything antithetical to Pharaoh or to oligarchy or to dictatorship or to anything like that. I believe in liberty and dynamics of dynamism, of democracy, because that's the only way that humanity can exist. And by the way, we could talk about capitalism for a brief moment. A lot of you equate, and I kind of think this all the time. Do you know everything to deal with capitalism or socialism or free markets or central planning or all of the isms combined? And if you don't in history, should you vote? Kind of a silly thing to say, but it's like, that's what's all on the line every single election. And I'm trying to give you the blueprint of everything that will convey your world to understand what side you're on. And so going back, briefly to Daenerys Targaryen, when she, firebombed, King's Landing, did she have a choice? Could there be anything but absolute victory? Well, in the conquest of Daenerys Targaryen, no way, right? And then she gets stabbed in the back, and then that whole thing. So, we're in really monstrously bad situation because of everything that could domino into Armageddon. But when you look back at Moses in Exodus, that creates the idea of the notion of Palestine, ironically, which it was called for thousands of years, which was the promised land, which in biblical text through the Jewish tradition in the 5 books of Moses is Exodus goes into Leviticus or Deuteronomy, both of which deal with law and society. That's the whole idea, that nobody is above the law. God made the law, nobody's above the law. And there's a lot of common sense type stuff. Don't lie, cheat, steal, grift, and everything else. That's really the idea of the 10 Commandments. Ironic, considering what I'm giving you in the con and everything that I know, based on what our society has become, given the greatest trick the devil ever played, convinced the world it didn't exist in context of the second coming. And so Moses leads this whole situation that ultimately comes into another stark focus with, of course, another, let's call, well, depending on how you look at it, savior, But Jesus Christ, right? And the way I said that was kind of funny. Jesus, right? What was Jesus doing? Who was Jesus? Jesus is a rabbi. Jesus was a rabbi who was a Jew who was basically fighting the corruption of his time. He didn't like the idea of the money changers having monopolies to prevent the poor from living in purity of God's light. That was the whole idea of breaking away from bondage, and that's why the whole thing went down on Passover, which is a revolutionary event, and everybody from the Pharisees to the Romans and, of course, Pontius Pilate knew that. And that was that thing at that time, what they were on the lookout, and here comes Jesus with his 12 apostles and him, i.e. 13, once again, to create a revolution. That was the idea, both in reality and in biblical text, right? But historical Jesus and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, what happens? Jesus gets crucified. Of course, he ascends to heaven because he was pure. And you can't get to heaven buying a stairway to heaven, right? That's the whole notion of it. And thus begins Christianity 500 years later with the Emperor Constantine that ultimately makes, Christianity the state religion. And then they go right back into all of the dark side, which is corruption. I'll tell you right now that all of the stuff that manifested into the Inquisition and a lot of the other elements of why Jews got kind of the bad rap on finance was because the monopoly of the Christian or Catholic or the Holy Roman Empire at that time, who was deeply involved with finance, and they needed to purge the Jews who were pretty damn good at finance at the time. Honestly, that's a big part of the story. And then many, many years later, and I'm conflating a lot of time periods and everything else, but long and the short of it is you get the Inquisition, and ironically, and also beautifully, if you ask me, there was a philosopher who really influenced millions over the course of time, the guy by the name of Maimonides, who came up with the 13 attributes of God, which is basically Judaism at the time of the Inquisition, which frames Judaism, and a lot of people believe in another version of 13, right? And so that happens during the Inquisition because the Catholic Church got corrupt, or I should say the Holy Roman Empire, because they're selling stairways to heaven to the landowners and the barons who basically want to throw a couple of gold coins at those that had the priesthood so that they could rape and pillage the land. That was the whole story of 1,000 years of the Middle Ages until we get to what? The schisms, and that ultimately lead to the Enlightenment. But why do we end up with Protestantism or Lutheranism or Methodism and all the other different fractured senses of Christianity? Because they didn't want to play that game. They didn't want to. You can't have the landowner or the tyrants basically buying a stairway to heaven. That was the whole notion of it. Okay. So that's the 1,000 freaking years after Jesus, which of course mankind has been battling the inner demons of greed and bloodlust and deception and everything in context to his God, the judge. I don't know if anybody in biblical text would be able to identify that, but that's kind of the idea. And not just in Judaism and not just in Christianity, but also in Islam. From what I understand, Muhammad's fighting a very similar battle against corruption. So corruption has always been the story in the end of empire that we have to cleanse, which is exactly what Jefferson said, which is exactly what I'm bringing to you. And I'm bringing it to you at a time what potentially could be, I don't know, Armageddon? But am I Jesus? Am I Moses? No, I'm just another Jew that just happens to be a producer that has the ultimate truth, which is Federal Reserve Act 13.3, which proves the ultimate tyranny. Our financial system puts themselves above the law. They have betrayed us all. They fancy themselves the new kings, the new pharaohs. Fuck them. Fuck corruption. Fuck fascism. Fuck evil. That's what this Clean New Deal is all about. And I want to circumnavigate it back to the ultimate 13, though. Okay? So as I've kind of pointed out that, there's these strange connections to 13 with Maimonides, with Jesus, the apostles, but it's also, as it turns out, and I just know this stuff. I've just kind of found like a loose interest in this whole thing. But the harmony of the universe and the cycles of the moon and blah, 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 right? But it also means revolution. And like I said, the attributes of God. Okay, pretty interesting stuff as far as I'm concerned, mythology-wise, right? So here's another a sort of parable as it relates to 13 and why I'm trying to raise $13 in context to everything that I'm giving you, in context to the time period. So ultimately, the myth goes that the Ark of the Covenant, 10 Commandments, whatever the agreement between the Israelites and God to be able to usher in the land of milk and honey and everything else. The contract was based on the law. And mythology-wise, this vessel, this Ark of the Covenant, winds up in King Solomon's temple, which is, of course, the Temple Mount and all the stuff that happened with Jesus and everything else. Okay, it's the center of Judaism, the Grand Temple, and everything else, right? And so ultimately, what happens is we have all of these different crusades. And I think there was like 9, 10, 11, something like that. But over the course of hundreds of years. And as it turns out, by this time period in the 14th century, you have the center of the Holy Roman Empire in France. And going again, kind of like to the Game of Thrones analogy, you have this continuity between the King of France and also the Pope, and they don't want a challenge to their monopoly as it relates to financing wars and their power and everything else, which is this supposed kind of like ancient, knowledge. And apparently somehow, and this again, mythology, just mythology, I don't buy into it. I'm just saying it because it's kind of fun to like rattle this off though, in terms of what we're in the midst of, because ultimately you have this scenario where the Knights Templars, who are fighting the Crusades, get this knowledge apparently through King Solomon's temple. They bring it back. They start their own financing, because they had to finance the wars anyway. So there's like these ways to travel to the Holy Land and everything else. But they come back. Somehow the King of France and the Pope get wind of this, and they create this sabotage of the King's Guard and everybody that's affiliated with that power base to basically get rid of the challenge. And they do it on Friday the 13th. But that they didn't kill all of the Knights Templars, and they went underground and they became the Masons, which became the guilds that built all of the churches in Europe throughout this whole time period, which ultimately came out of the Dark Ages and led to the Renaissance and the New Enlightenment, that ultimately had all of these humanist ideas that evolved to none other than, of course, the Founding Fathers. Again, mythology, right? But I do find it kind of interesting that we had 13 colonies. I don't know exactly how it came to be, coincidence, was there a plan? But there was 13 colonies. And if you look at our dollar bill, you see the 13 stairs of the pyramid to the eye of providence, which is God, and the liberty and justice for all, which God, is on the side of the righteous. And this is the righteous grind, by the way. And, if you look at the eagle, you have 13 talons to represent the colonies, 13 quiver of arrows to represent the God of war and the ability to fight for liberty and justice. And then also the olive branches, 13 olive branches, and the left talons. And all of this symbology is all over the place in America. And again, like I said, 13 means the attributes of God in Maimonides, and also revolution. And quite frankly, the balance and harmony of the universe. So there's a lot of reasons that created the original 13 colonies, that created separation of powers in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution in order to form a more perfect union for a government of by and for the people, if you can keep it. And I'm not smiling because it's already been lost, okay? The insurrection, the January 6th insurrection with Donald Trump, that happened in 2020. The real insurrection happened in 2009 as a result of what I'm telling you, where the guys that destroyed the world, our financial system, who are the revolving door of our justice system and our finance system and everybody else, the professionals, they circled the wagons to protect themselves, and then basically they fancied themselves kings that they could discard all of the American people that didn't, get the upside of this, which was the top 10%. But the real guys that got the full upside of it, and any of you have been following what, the wealth of billionaires since COVID and everything else, we saw, the wealth of billionaires like double during COVID. You ever wonder how that happened? Well, because of the system that I'm telling you about. We've pumped since 2009. I keep saying that I've got the $29 trillion truth, but it has evolved into the $70 trillion revelation that's kept this system of tyranny afloat. And the Green New Deal, the Clean New Deal, is me to reveal to you, particularly because the whole world revolves on fossil fuel, and fossil fuel is going to win if we go to a global war, and they're the only ones, the last man standing, and they're the ultimate tyranny, okay? Through this whole, metaphor that I said about end times and the rapture and all that fucking insanity because of, like I mentioned earlier, if I've got my head clear, I'm talking about a lot of information, but Israel, the modern Israel, fancies itself another autocracy. They might want to be a religious theocracy just like Saudi Arabia because that's how it works. Democracy apparently doesn't work in the Middle East because you can't have a partner in peace if you've got Hamas and Hezbollah, honestly. Sorry, Roger Waters, I know you're anti-fascist, but you've got to also understand the insanity of these guys. And I understand that they've been, in barricades for the last 20 years and living on a open air prison and everything else, but they were creating suicide bombing and everything else to destroy Israel in the meantime. And Israel came out of the goddamn Holocaust, and the only way to live is to, I guess, destroy. If you really want to know the truth, I guess that's what we're looking at. Does that make it okay? No. What makes it okay is I don't know, I wanted creative destruction because that is, by the way, capitalism, but we're not a capitalist state because of what I'm telling you. Because if we were, then all the bad guys that destroyed the world with everything that I'm telling you, they would have been gone. They would have been arrested. All of their money would have been taken back. But that's not what would happen. We gave tens of trillions of dollars based on the full faith and credit of the United States illegally to the guys that pulled off the biggest racketeering enterprise in the history of the world, and they're in complete power. And they're the ones who fund all this shit. And they're the ones who benefit from all this shit. All that we're looking at in a potential World War III is really not that different than what happened in World War I. We're a bunch of fiefdoms and crowns and geopolitical, monarchies and everybody else. We're basically fighting for their control and, the alliances and everything else. That's kind of like what we're in the midst of. And yet there's more. And I could go on and on and on. I've probably gone on long enough, but I want to summarize it this way in terms of, again, to kind of count off all the 13s because it's just such a trip. Be prepared for more misery. The shit that Hamas is doing right now, cutting off the heads of dead children and women, is so horrific. It is exactly what, unfortunately, the defense minister of Israel said, that they're all animals. But they're not all animals. We know that. But at the same time, they didn't overthrow the guys who are just disgusting. And so what happens in that whole situation? War. That's fucking war. That's what happens. And so that's what's going to happen to us, the American people, with the powers that be that have complete control of the judiciary, that have corrupted the judiciary, that have complete control of finance through monopolies and everything else, and who have complete control of what we think is democracy. If Donald Trump wins the election, does that save democracy? The death of democracy is what gave us Donald Trump. And oh yeah, by the way, Donald Trump is the ultimate mirror of everything that the United States government is demonstrating that he's guilty of, that Wall Street got away with. Donald Trump is being convicted of defrauding the United States, or indicted until he's convicted on the 91 indictments so far, of defrauding the United States based on documentation fraud, using illegal reps and warranties to basically create a racketeering enterprise that ultimately led to deceptive acts and practices and documentation fraud to steal the election, that ultimately he used corrupt attorneys and judges to do it. That's what Wall Street did times gazillions. There is no ands, ifs, or buts. People, 13 is the number of revolution and the principles and attributes of God. Look, I am not Moses, but I am delivering the Exodus against corruption. I am not Jesus. I don't walk on water, but I am delivering the resurrection of the American dream through the Clean New Deal if we can destroy the pollution of corruption. The only way we can do that is if we unite and we come together equipped with the facts, and that we are as relentless towards liberty and justice as they are towards corruption and destroying us. Do you want to be in a situation where we have 400 years of literally bondage to a corporate fascist state undergirded by socialism for criminals that wants to fuel fascism? And I'll finish off with this in terms of this conundrum of Israel and Jews and all the rest of it, okay? Look, there's going to be another side of this fucking insanity as far as it relates to anti-Semitism. And you're going to see Nazis out there, and they already have been, and they have been for decades and decades, but it's going to get more and more focused because of Steve Bannon's a smart guy, and he knows a lot of this stuff because of his story. But what he feeds, the chump in chief, who is basically Wag the Dog, is just reading off a teleprompter and being the comedian dumbass jackass that he is. He's the king of all jackasses, Trump. But there are billionaires and smart guys that want to see a white, supremacist revolution because they like that. That works for them. And they can have just as much control. It's really the battle of the new Confederates versus the new robber barons and everything that constitutes. But the bottom line is that the right wing, and by the way, the left wing is going to do this too, that are on the side of Hezbollah and Hamas and that sort of thing. They're going to say, look, the Jews own the world. They own finance. And look, this guy Patrick, who's Jewish, is revealing it to us. And yeah, they did destroy the world because they are that corrupt, and they were the guys that set us all up in this massive griftopia. And then they own the judiciary and they own the media. And there's a lot of very smart Jewish people that have gotten the highest levels of all of those places that did indeed play ball in this situation, if not engineer it, architect it, pull it off, and then pull the wool over all of our eyes. Yeah, they're Jews. That doesn't mean they did it because they're Jewish. They're just fucking assholes. They're worms. They're asshole maggots that did this. And yeah, they should have all of their money taken away and they should be thrown in jail. That's what a civilized society with the facts is designed to do, which is why we had revolutions and fought for 240 some odd years to be able to do that. And here it's up to us. And we have to do it. And I will remind you that it wasn't just Jews, by the way. There was African Americans, there was women, there was people of all faiths that are involved in the cover-up. What I'm telling you at the end of this incredible journey that I've been on, that I'm about to reach my 55th birthday, when I've had to go to the ends of the world and back to pick my life up, to redeem myself, to understand the truth, is to bestow it upon you. Lady Light, the torch of liberty, to light up the night of darkness, because I'm on the side of light. If you're going to take, this is the force, right? I mean, we can use every analogy that's ever been out there, but this is our reality, people. And so the only peaceful way we're going to do that is if you understand the truth and you invest and you get other people to come on board, you become a vector. We all come together to basically overwhelm the system of corruption that has overwhelmed us. That is the only way we can punch through this madness that might be the end times. And ironically, would this be the second coming? Maybe. I don't know. All I know is what I know, which is you, me, and everybody you see who isn't a Nazi has to come together to champion dignity, integrity, sustainability, liberty, and beauty, to manifest, unity, to destroy the misery of tyranny, to create the clean New Deal. There's only one way to do that, with the truth. And I wanted to talk about this, and I'm going to finish talking about this, because I've got a whole bunch of hashtags that we're going to put on t-shirts that we'll give you if you're invested and you bring in 13 people, and you'll get many of these hashtags that include failure is not an option, which of course goes back to my namesake, Patrick Lovell, which is Jim Lovell, Apollo 13. Failure is not an option. There's a whole story with that. And then also Rise, Roar, Revolt, which is really interesting in terms of, there was a movie that I got that from. It was an Indian movie that was rebelling against English imperialism, which many might argue is, Jewish or Israeli imperialism in the way it all works. And, I'm on that side, right? I was like, oh my God, that movie was so fantastic. And it was like, yeah, I mean, imperialism and monarchy and monopoly is a horrible thing, especially if it's used to, increase the power of those that didn't earn it for the right reasons. And that's why this is also the righteous grind. And so the final thing I'll say on it is what I always say. Onwards and upwards. Thanks for listening.